11 days. That is the exact amount of time it should have taken for the Israelites to walk from the shadow of Mount Horeb to the lush green borders of the Promised Land. 11 days of marching, a standard trek for a group of that size. Yet if you look at the historical and biblical record, those 11 days stretched into a grueling, bone-bleaching 40-year odyssey through some of the most inhospitable terrain on the planet. Why? Why would a divine architect, a God who had just crushed the greatest empire on earth with 10 supernatural plagues, keep his chosen people walking in circles until an entire generation was literally buried beneath the Sinai sands? Most people will tell you it was a simple punishment. They disobeyed, they doubted, and so they were put in timeout by the Almighty. But that explanation is dangerously incomplete. If you look closer at the geography, the sociology, and the brutal reality of the Bronze Age Levant, you realize that the 40-year wilderness journey wasn't a delay. It was a tactical, psychological, and spiritual deconstruction of a slave race. Imagine the scene at Kadesh Barnea. You have over 1 million people standing on the precipice of everything they have ever dreamed of. The land flowing with milk and honey is right there. You can almost smell the vineyards. But when the 12 spies return, 10 of them bring back a report that spreads through the camp like a virus. They talk of giants. They talk of walled cities that reach the heavens. They look at themselves and say, "We were like grasshoppers in our own sight." In that single moment of collective terror, the Israelites revealed a devastating truth. You can take the people out of Egypt, but you cannot take Egypt out of the people. They had the bodies of free men, but the nervous systems of slaves. They were psychologically incapable of occupying the Promised Land because they were still carrying the chains of Pharaoh in their minds. This video isn't just a history lesson about ancient nomads. We are diving into the terrifying why behind the 40-year sentence. We're going to explore the slave mindset versus the warrior identity. We are going to look at the geographical anomalies that prove this wasn't just a wrong turn in the desert. We're going to examine the specific deaths that had to occur before the nation could move forward. Think about it. Why did God wait for the very last person of the old generation to die before the Jordan River parted? Why was Moses, the man who saw God face to face, forbidden from crossing that final border? And perhaps most importantly for you, watching this today, is it possible that the desert season you feel trapped in right now isn't a punishment for your past, but a mandatory reboot for your future? If the journey was supposed to take 11 days, but you're on year 10, you need to understand the mechanics of the wilderness. Because the desert doesn't just kill people, it kills versions of people. It strips away the dependencies, the fears, and the grasshopper mentality until only the warrior remains. We are going to break down the book of Numbers like you've never seen it before. We're going to look at the tabernacle as a mobile psychological headquarters and the manna as a tool for total cognitive restructuring. By the end of this, you'll realize that the 40 years in the desert wasn't a waste of time. It was the most efficient way to build a nation that could survive the giants waiting on the other side. The question isn't why it took them so long to get to the land. The question is, why did it take so long for the land to get into them? Let's go deep into the dust and the fire. Let's find out what actually happened during those 4 decades of silence and why the hidden purpose of the wilderness is the only thing standing between you and your own promised land. If you've ever felt like God is moving too slowly, or like you're walking in circles while everyone else is crossing the finish line, you cannot afford to look away. Because the secret to the 40 years isn't about geography, it's about the brutal, beautiful process of becoming someone new. Why did an 11-day trip turn into a 40-year funeral march? The answer is more shocking and more hopeful than you've been led to believe. Let's unlock the mystery of the Sinai. To understand why a 2-week hike turned into a 4-decade death march, we have to stop looking at the map and start looking at the architecture of the human soul. When the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, the water didn't just drown Pharaoh's army, it severed the only umbilical cord they had ever known. For 400 years, 10 generations, the Israelites were not a nation. They were an asset. They were a line item in the Egyptian ledger. When you are a slave for 4 centuries, your identity isn't something you create. It's something that is imposed upon you. Your wake-up call is a whip. Your purpose is a brick. Your value is your caloric output versus your physical labor. In Egypt, every single decision was made for them. What to eat, when to sleep, where to stand, how to move. This creates a specific kind of psychological comfort, the comfort of zero responsibility. And this is the first great mystery of the wilderness. The Israelites didn't just fear the giants in Canaan, they missed the chains in Egypt. Think about that. They were literally standing in the presence of the divine, eating supernatural bread falling from the sky, and yet, at the first sign of discomfort, the collective cry wasn't, "Lead us forward." It was, "Take us back." They actually said, "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." This is what psychologists call learned helplessness on a national scale. This wasn't a group of pioneers. It was a massive traumatized population suffering from a collective Stockholm syndrome. God could perform a miracle to open the sea, but he couldn't perform a miracle to open their minds, because free will is the one thing a creator refuses to override. If they were going to be free, they had to choose it. But they couldn't choose it because their choice maker was broken. Every time they hit a roadblock, a lack of water at Rephidim, a craving for meat, a delay in Moses coming down from the mountain, the slave OS inside their brains would reboot. The software of bondage is programmed for immediate gratification and total security. The software of a warrior is programmed for long-term vision and calculated risk. The Israelites were running slaves 1.0 in a world that required warriors 2.0. This is the hidden agony of the 40-year sentence. It wasn't that God was angry in the way humans get angry. It was a cold, hard biological necessity. You cannot build a sovereign nation out of people who are still waiting for a master to tell them when to breathe. Let's look at the logistics of this school of suffering. The Sinai Peninsula is one of the most brutal environments on the planet. It is a world of limestone plateaus, jagged granite peaks, and temperatures that swing 60 degrees between noon and midnight. There is no infrastructure. There are no grocery stores. There is no backup plan. In this vacuum of civilization, God stripped away every secondary dependency. In Egypt, they depended on the Nile, a predictable seasonal river. In the desert, they had to depend on the early rain and the latter rain, things they couldn't control. In Egypt, they ate the leeks and onions of the delta, heavy, pungent, earthy foods. In the desert, they ate manna, a thin bread that tasted like honey, and wafers, a food that required them to trust that today's provision wouldn't rot by tomorrow. This was total cognitive restructuring. It was a 40-year detox program designed to flush the Egyptian security at the cost of sovereignty mindset out of their systems. But there's a darker side to this mystery. Historians and sociologists often talk about the generation gap. But what happened in the Sinai was a generation cull. We have to address the brutal reality of the book of Numbers. God essentially told them, "You said your children would be prey in this land, fine. Your children will inherit it, but your corpses will fall in this wilderness." For 38 of those 40 years, the Israelites weren't really moving toward a destination. They were waiting for a funeral to end. They were waiting for the last person who remembered the taste of Egyptian water to die. Why such a harsh sentence? Because the grasshopper mentality is contagious. It's a viral thought pattern. If you have a core group of elders who remember being beaten and who still flinch when they see a shadow that looks like a whip, they will pass that flinch down to their children. To conquer the walled cities of Jericho and Ai, you couldn't have soldiers who flinched. You needed a generation that had never known a master. You needed a generation whose only home was the move, whose only ceiling was the pillar of fire, and whose only king was an invisible God. The desert was a filter. It was designed to catch the cowards and the complainers and hold them in place until they were gone, allowing only the purified essence of the nation to pass through the narrow neck of the Jordan River. And this is where it gets personal for you. We often look at the Israelites and judge them. We think, how could you see the Red Sea part and then complain about the food 2 days later? But look at your own life. How many times have you been given a massive opportunity, a promised land moment in your career, your relationships, or your personal growth only to sabotage it because you were afraid of the giants? How many times have you retreated to a toxic situation because even though it was painful, it was familiar? The wilderness is that awkward, painful gap between who you were and who you are meant to be. It feels like you're walking in circles, but in reality, you are being deconstructed. The you that survived the trauma of your past is not the you that can handle the responsibility of your future. The 40 years wasn't a travel delay. It was a manufacturing process. But here is the pattern interrupt, the piece of the puzzle that changes everything we just discussed. If the 40 years were truly about killing off the slave generation so that a new warrior generation could take the land, then why was the most important, most holy, and most non-slave person of all, Moses, also forbidden from entering? Moses didn't have a slave mindset. He was raised in the palace. He was a prince of Egypt. He was the one who stood up to Pharaoh. He was the one who saw the glory of God on the mountain until his face literally glowed with radioactive light. If anyone was ready for the promised land, it was him. And yet the man who led them through the 40-year funeral march was himself forced to join the dead. This reveals a terrifying truth. The wilderness doesn't just kill the bad versions of us. Sometimes it demands the sacrifice of the very things we think are most necessary for our survival. Why was the greatest leader in history cancelled at the finish line? The answer isn't a matter of geography or even a matter of sin in the way we traditionally think about it. It's about a fundamental shift in the nature of power. Because as it turns out, the old way of doing things, even the God-ordained way of the past, can become the biggest obstacle to the future. To understand the 40 years, we have to look at the one thing Moses did that proved he could never ever cross that river. To understand why Moses, the man who literally carried the nation on his back, was barred from the finish line, you have to look at a single violent moment at a place called Meribah. The people were thirsty. Again, they were complaining again. God told Moses, speak to the rock, just talk to it. But Moses didn't speak. He took his staff and he smashed that rock twice. Water poured out. The people drank. On the surface, it looked like a success, but in the eyes of the divine, it was a catastrophic failure. Why? Because Moses was using the tools of the past to solve the problems of the future. In Egypt, power was expressed through a staff. It was about striking, forcing, and conquering. But the promised land wasn't going to be won by a dictator with a stick. It was going to be won by a people who listened to a voice. By striking the rock, Moses proved he was still a product of the Egyptian era. He was a liberator, but he wasn't a king. And that's the brutal reality of the wilderness. The very person who gets you out of your Egypt is rarely the person who can lead you into your promised land. Your deliverer mindset will eventually become your limit mindset. But if Moses was the old operating system, the tabernacle was the new hardware. Most people see the tabernacle as a religious tent. They're wrong. It was a mobile psychological anchor. Think about the geography of the camp. 12 tribes arranged in a perfect square, and right in the dead center, the tabernacle. This was the first time in human history that an entire nation was organized around an idea rather than a person. In Egypt, everything pointed to Pharaoh's palace. In the desert, everything pointed to the presence. If you were a common Israelite waking up in your tent, the first thing you saw wasn't your neighbor's property or a government building. It was the pillar of fire. This was total environmental conditioning. God was moving the center of gravity from the external Pharaoh to the internal, the spirit. He was teaching them that stability doesn't come from a fixed location. It comes from a fixed focus. If the cloud moved, you moved. If the cloud stayed, you stayed. This destroyed the concept of home as a physical plot of land and redefined home as alignment with the divine. But alignment requires more than just looking at a cloud. It requires a complete purge of the slave diet. Let's talk about the manna. For 40 years they ate the same thing every day. No variety, no spice, no Egyptian leeks. This wasn't just about nutrition. It was about dependency. In Egypt, you worked for your food. In the desert, your food was a gift that expired in 24 hours. This created a trust loop. If you tried to hoard it to go back to that old slave mentality of scarcity, it rotted and grew worms. The wilderness was forcing them to live in the eternal now. It was the ultimate cure for anxiety. Because you can't be a warrior if you're constantly worried about tomorrow's breakfast. But even with supernatural bread, the old virus was still there. It surfaced in the most terrifying way possible, the plague of the fiery serpents. The people started grumbling again. They hated the worthless food, so the desert did what the desert does. It sent the snakes. People started dying in droves. This is where the story gets strange. God doesn't just kill the snakes. He tells Moses to make a bronze snake, put it on a pole, and tell everyone, if you get bitten, look at the bronze snake, and you will live. This is the ultimate psychological payoff. Why look at the thing that's killing you? Because you cannot heal what you refuse to look at. The bronze snake was a mirror. It represented their own toxic rebellion. To be healed, they had to face the reality of their own bite. The wilderness is where you stop running from your shadows and start looking them in the eye. But looking isn't enough. Something still had to die. This brings us to the great census. If you read the book of Numbers, it's mostly just lists of names and numbers. It's boring until you realize what's actually happening. There are two censuses, one at the beginning and one at the end. When you compare the two lists, you see a terrifying missing population. Nearly 600,000 men from the first list are gone, erased. The second list is a completely different group of people. This wasn't just a record-keeping exercise. This was a military audit. The first list was a list of refugees. The second list was a list of soldiers. The 40 years was the time it took for the refugee DNA to be replaced by the soldier DNA. But how do you turn a child born in a tent into a giant killer? You take away their safety nets. Think about the children of the wilderness. They never saw the Red Sea part. They never saw the plagues. They never tasted the water of the Nile. All they knew was the heat, the dust, and the manna. They were the first generation in 400 years to be born free. They didn't have the trauma response of their parents. When their parents saw a walled city, they saw a prison. When the children saw a walled city, they saw a target. But there was one final obstacle. One last remnant of the slave generation that had to be dealt with before they could cross the Jordan. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a group. It was a memory. The memory of Egypt was like a ghost haunting the camp. Every time things got hard, someone would bring up the good old days in the Delta. Even Moses in his final speeches sounds like a man trying to exorcise a demon from a nation's soul. He knew that if even 1 ounce of Egyptian longing crossed that river, the promised land would just become a second Egypt. So God did the unthinkable. He waited. He waited for the very last man of the old generation to draw his last breath. Imagine the tension. The promised land is right there. You can see the hills of Jericho from the mountain peaks, but the cloud doesn't move. Day after day, week after week, the nation sits and waits. Why? Because there is one old man left in a tent somewhere who still remembers the taste of Pharaoh's bread. And as long as he is alive, the nation is tethered to the past. The wilderness is not a place you leave when you are ready. It is a place you leave when your past is finally officially dead. But here is the twist that no one sees coming. If the 40 years was a manufacturing process for warriors, and if the old generation had to die, why did the new generation immediately fail as soon as they crossed the river? Why did they struggle with the same patterns of doubt and idolatry? It reveals the most uncomfortable truth of the entire Sinai Odyssey. The desert didn't just kill the slaves. It revealed that the slave isn't a person, it's a choice. And as the new generation stood on the banks of the Jordan, looking at the water that was about to part, they realized that the giants they were about to face weren't the ones behind the walls of Jericho. The real giants were the ones they had been carrying through the dust for 4 decades. The Jordan River was about to part, but a new question was rising from the water. If the desert didn't change you, what makes you think the promised land will? Because the greatest danger of the wilderness isn't dying in the heat. It's surviving the heat and keeping the same heart. Now we have to look at the end game. Because there is a specific encoded reason why the journey ended at the Jordan, and why the man who led them there was replaced by a man whose name means salvation. The transition from Moses to Joshua isn't just a change in leadership. It's a shift in the very fabric of how God interacts with humanity. And if you don't understand this shift, you will spend your entire life waiting for a miracle while the land stays out of reach. Why did Moses have to die on a mountain alone? And what did Joshua have that the greatest prophet in history lacked? The answer lies in the spirit of the spy, and the one thing Caleb saw that everyone else missed. The transition from Moses to Joshua was not a failure of leadership. It was a fundamental shift in the frequency of God's interaction with man. Moses was the prophet of the Exodus, the man of the law, the one who saw the no of the past and broke the chains. But the law can only take you to the edge of the promise. It cannot walk you into the possession of it. Moses had to die because he was the physical embodiment of the Exodus era. He was the shepherd of refugees. Joshua, however, was the general of an army. The name Joshua Yehoshua is the same root as the name Jesus. It means the Lord is salvation. The shift from Moses to Joshua was a signal to the universe that the season of escaping was over and the season of occupying had begun. Moses used a staff to strike the rock. Joshua used his voice to command the sun to stand still. One was about survival, the other was about dominion. And this is the core of the 40-year mystery. God wasn't looking for people who could survive his miracles. He was looking for people who could partner with his power. This brings us to the spirit of the spy. Remember, 12 men went into the land. 10 saw giants and felt like grasshoppers. 2, Caleb and Joshua, saw the same giants and felt like they were looking at bread. The Bible says Caleb had a different spirit. What was that spirit? It wasn't the absence of fear. It was the absence of the slave filter. While the 10 spies were calculating their chances of survival based on their own strength, Caleb and Joshua were calculating the giants' chances of survival based on God's presence. The wilderness was the laboratory where that different spirit was synthesized. It was a 40-year chemical reaction where the carbon of a slave was pressurized into the diamond of a conqueror. Think about the Jordan River. When the Israelites crossed the Red Sea 40 years earlier, the water parted before they stepped in. They were terrified, running for their lives, and God did everything for them. It was a rescue mission for infants. But 40 years later at the Jordan, the water didn't move an inch until the priests carrying the ark stepped their feet into the current. Do you see the difference? In the Red Sea, the miracle created the path. In the Jordan, the step of faith created the miracle. This was the graduation ceremony. This was the proof that the warrior identity had finally taken hold. They weren't waiting for a master to save them. They were moving as heirs to claim what was already theirs. So we return to the ultimate why. Why 40 years for an 11-day trip? Because the promised land is not just a destination, it's a responsibility. If God had given the land to the first generation, they would have turned it into a second Egypt within a decade. They would have built monuments to their own fears. They would have looked for a pharaoh to serve because they didn't know how to be free. The 40 years wasn't a delay of God's promise. It was a protection of it. God loved them too much to give them a kingdom before he gave them the character to keep it. The 11-day version of you is the one who wants the result without the process. It's the version that wants the milk and honey, but still has the grasshopper soul. But the 40-year version of you, that version is dangerous. That version has been through the fire. That version has watched its dependencies die and its fears rot. That version doesn't need a pillar of fire to know that God is present. It carries the presence within. The desert didn't just kill a generation of slaves. It birthed a nation of kings. It stripped away the garlic and leeks of Egypt until they could taste the supernatural. It silenced the noise of the world until they could hear the whisper of the divine. The Jordan River is about to part, but the water isn't waiting for the right time. It's waiting for the right you. The 40 years was never about the distance between Mount Horeb and Kadesh Barnea. It was about the distance between the slave and the son. It was about the brutal beautiful, and mandatory process of becoming someone who doesn't just enter the land, but someone the land actually recognizes as its rightful owner. If you are in your own wilderness right now, if you are on year 10 of an 11-day journey, don't look at the map. Look at your heart. Stop asking God how much longer it will take to get to the land, and start asking Him how much longer it will take to get the land into you. Because the moment the slave inside you finally dies, the Jordan will have no choice but to move out of your way. The desert isn't your grave, it's your womb. And the giants on the other side, they aren't there to kill you. They are there to prove who you have finally become. The 40 years is over. It's time to stop wandering and start occupying. The fire didn't consume you. It refined you. And now the land is waiting for its warrior. You are standing at the edge of your own Jordan right now. The heat of the fire has done its work. The slave you used to be is a ghost, a remnant of a past that no longer has the legal right to claim your future. The warrior you are becoming is finally breathing, finally seeing the giants, not as obstacles, but as the very bread that will sustain your growth. But here is the brutal reality of the promised land. Occupying it is a far greater challenge than simply entering it. Joshua didn't just cross the river and call it a day. He had to maintain the spirit of a conqueror every single morning for the rest of his life. He had to keep the slave filter from ever trying to reattach itself to his vision. If you feel that shift in your frequency, if you realize that your season of survival is officially over and your season of dominion has begun, then you understand that you cannot go back to the voices of the wilderness. You cannot allow your mind to wander back to the comfort of the garlic and leeks of Egypt when God has called you to taste the supernatural. You need an environment that speaks to the king inside you, not the refugee. You need a consistent flow of truth that silences the grasshopper internal dialogue and reinforces the warrior identity you've just birthed in the desert. This is why we are here. We are building more than a channel. We are building a camp of Joshuas and Calebs, a community of individuals who refuse to stay in the 11-day version of themselves and have committed to the 40-year transformation. By making the decision to join this movement, you aren't just clicking a button. You are planting your feet in a frequency of dominion. You are ensuring that as you step into your territory, you are surrounded by the blueprints, the strategies, and the spiritual fire necessary to hold the ground you take. If this message is the mirror that finally showed you who you really are, then seal that identity today. Make the commitment to stay in this frequency so that the slave never finds a way back into your heart. But as you stand at this riverbank ready to move, there is one more thing you must understand. Possession requires more than just a spirit. It requires a strategy. The first giant you face isn't physical. It's the architecture of your own authority. To help you move from the riverbank directly into the heart of your inheritance, you need to understand exactly how to wield the voice of the commander that Joshua used to stop the sun. You've killed the slave. Now it's time to learn how to lead as a son. I have prepared a specific deep dive into the mechanics of spiritual authority that serves as the direct sequel to what you've just experienced. It is the tactical manual for the warrior who is finished wandering. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. Do not let this momentum die at the water's edge. The Jordan has moved because you stepped in now. Walk through and see what happens when the land finally meets its rightful owner. I'll see you in the next session. Your season of occupation starts now.